So why start with a photo of Churchill? Well, there's a quote from him that he had in his post-war memoirs that's kind of telling about the whole Battle of the Atlantic. That goes, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Churchill, it shows just how important the Battle of the Atlantic was to the Allies and how perilous the situation was against the U-boats. It's the longest-running battle of the war, from the first day to the last day. But what exactly is this battle? Why was it important? And to do that, we need to take a kind of a quick little timeline journey and see how this all unfolded. This is one of my favorite artifacts we have in the collection at the museum. This is a life jacket from the SS Athenia, and it was from a guy named Michael McShane, and this was a passenger liner that sunk by U-30 on September 3rd, 1939. So that's just 2 days after the war is officially declared. 112 people were lost out of over 1,400 on board. And in the expectation of the war and just how important this tonnage war was going to be, the U-boats were already pre-positioned before they're at war. So the U-boats are already in the Atlantic, and here we are 2 days in, they're already sinking merchant ships. But what exactly is a tonnage war? What does this mean? Well, the architect of this is Admiral Dönitz. He served in U-boats in the First World War, and he's actually taken prisoner by the Allies. He was the mastermind behind what they called Rudel tactic, Wolfpack tactics. The idea was to mass enough U-boats around the convoy to overwhelm the escorting warships. Dönitz was convinced for the Germans to have any chance of success in winning a war against the Allies, they needed to sink more ships than we could build, is what it boiled down to. The Germans figured they needed to sink about 700,000 tons of shipping every month. The British actually thought it was less than that at 600,000. So, kind of a side note, we actually pulled this off against the Japanese in the Pacific, but that's a different topic for a different day. The primary weapon the Germans would be using would be this. It's the Type 7 U-boat. One thing to keep in mind about submarines in World War II, especially at the beginning of the war as the war goes on, they're primarily on the surface. They're not really true submarines like we know today. These subs are about 1,100 tons, can go about 11,000 miles to stick at about 12 knots. On the surface, they could have a top speed of 18 knots, which made them faster than some of the escorts for some of these convoys. So they could, if they spotted a convoy, they could run out ahead of a convoy and just kind of wait for them to come. Submerged, they could go about 7 knots for about 60 miles on battery. They could carry electric or gas-powered torpedoes. But at the start of the war, the Germans actually only had about 39 U-boats that were operational. That number, a very small percentage of them could actually go on patrol. But these Type 7 U-boats, they produce over 700 of them during the war. I want to say the number is 709, something like that. So the British had used convoys in the First World War and thought they could kind of contain the U-boat threat. But the game changes, so to speak, when France falls. And when that happens, the Germans gain access to all the French channel ports and Atlantic ports, and it cut down on the time that the Germans would have to spend getting into the Atlantic, and it lengthened the time they could spend on patrol. So the result was the first German happy time, as they called it. Between June and October 1940, they sank 1.4 million tons of shipping in the Atlantic. The British needed help, and they turned to the Americans, who we gave them 50 old World War I destroyers in return for leases on British overseas bases. It's kind of a mixed deal for the British. A lot of these destroyers have been laid up for a very long time and needed a lot of work to make them seaworthy. Some people say this is kind of the beginning and the end of the British Empire too. It's a whole another. The point is, there's a lot of politics going on in the background in this whole Battle of Atlantic the whole time. It's really interesting. Until late 1940 into 1941, the United States is acting less neutral and more clearly on the side of the Allies. We're basically fighting an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic, especially after April 16th, 1941, when we start conducting what we call neutrality patrols. We're basically going to escort merchant convoys to a meeting point in the Atlantic where the British take over. That helps the British because it allows them to move desperately needed, like destroyers or whatever, somewhere else. It frees them up to go somewhere else. This, of course, infuriated the Germans, but Hitler ordered no attacks on U.S. ships. Part of the reason was because of, in the First World, one of the reasons we get into the First World War is Germans unrestricted submarine warfare on us then. So they don't want to pull us in yet. However, incidents did happen, and American lives were lost. Two of the most notable attacks were on the Kearney and the Reuben James, two American destroyers. The Kearney is torpedoed by U-568 in October 1941. It survives. This is a picture of the Kearney after it takes its torpedo hit in port. But 11 men are killed and 22 are wounded. Just a few days later, the Reuben James is torpedoed and actually sunk by U-552, and 100 men are killed and about 44 survive. When we officially go to war in December 41, both sides are eager for the gloves to come off. You know, I mean, we're sick of looking at each other, I guess. Unfortunately for us, Dermot sends his U-boats into American waters, and unfortunately for us, the results are devastating. In 3 weeks, 5 German U-boats sank 25 ships and 157,000 tons of shipping. It's the beginning of the Germans' second happy time. In May, the Germans sank 584,000 tons of shipping. It's their second highest total for the whole war in May 1942. From January to July 42, the Germans sank 397 Allied ships and killed 5,000 men around the eastern seaboard and Gulf of Mexico. A lot of people don't realize they were sinking ships right here at the mouth of the Mississippi River. That's how far in the Germans actually got. But who's responsible for this kind of carnage off American shores? Well, a good chunk of it's Admiral King, believe it or not. He doesn't deserve all the blame, but a good chunk of it. U.S. defenses are totally inadequate, and he resisted British assistance. We didn't have a complete convoy system in U.S. waters until September 1942, which meant ships sailing alone were still vulnerable to U-boat attack. We also never do a blackout along our shorelines because people were complaining that it would hurt tourism. So what would happen, some merchant ships would wait to sail at night, but with the lights on the shoreline, the easiest way to show you this, I don't have models like Josh yesterday, but the ship's coming by at night and it's silhouetted against the shoreline. So German U-boat sees the ship and can surface most of the time and use its deck gun. It doesn't even need to use the torpedo and can sink it. You know, a lot of people believe King didn't just like the British, and maybe that's why he resisted help and changing tactics for so long. I don't think he hated them, but at the end of the day, King was brilliant, but he was kind of a jerk too. Brilliant, but a jerk. And of course, you got to remember at the same time, we're fighting the Japanese. We have our hands full with the Japanese in the Pacific. So he really doesn't want to assign destroyers to the Atlantic where we really need them in the Pacific. But the discussion about King and his whole tactics during this time is whole nother webinar. So why May 1943? Well, May 43 is kind of the beginning of the culmination of years of Allied advances in technology, training, ships, tactics, planes, intelligence gathering. But in order to see where all this, to understand why this happened, then we got to jump back one more time to 1940. And in September of 1940, Henry Tizard came to the United States with a British delegation, and they basically are offering the United States all of their technological advances for access to U.S. assembly lines. They had the technology, but couldn't manufacture or improve it as quickly as we could. Some of the items they shared were plans for a proximity fuse, rockets, gun sights, self-sealing fuel tanks, jet engine design. But probably the most important thing they brought was this, the cavity magnetron. And if you've ever heard of this, then you've also heard the famous quote that it was the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The cavity magnetron was a technological game changer for the U.S., and we essentially leap ahead with our radar technology by 2 years as soon as they bring this to the United States. The cavity magnetron allowed radar to be small enough to be mounted onto ships and planes. Radar in aircraft becomes one of the most important developments in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. You see here, here's a TBF Avenger, and if you look on the wing, it kind of looks like a fuel tank. That's the radar pod mounted onto a TBF Avenger. Having radar on aircraft allows us to determine range, bearing, size of something on the surface of the ocean, and then a plane could dive down and attack the U-boat and hopefully sink it. One other development, HFDF, or HFDF. Could figure out where a radio signal was transmitted and could be fitted to ships. This is a HFDF mounted on a ship here in this photo. It allowed us to get a more accurate fix on a U-boat, essentially. It had a range of 25 miles, and 2 escorts per convoy had HFDF by spring 43. So if you had one, you could kind of figure it out, but 2 or 3 or more really narrowed down where on the surface a U-boat could be. You also had sonar. Sonar had a 1,300-yard range to start with and improved as the war went on. Hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are 24 contact fused projectiles. Each of these things had 50 pounds of TNT in them. And they all launch off, and they kind of land in a circle in the water that surround the U-boat. We also had standard depth charges that were usually about 250 pounds and take at 16 feet a second. It could crack a U-boat hull open at about 20 feet and damage it within 50. So it was a pretty devastating weapon as well. The one thing most of people probably know about is the Enigma machines and cracking that. Enigma is a typewriter type machine with 3, later 4 rotors on it. It was changing letters and numbers, and I've read it had up to 150 million different combinations. The Germans thought it was totally unbreakable. The Polish actually break into it first, and then the British at Bletchley Park kind of take it to a next level. We crack into the Luftwaffe of the Wehrmacht, and then the Kriegsmarine last. During the first half of 1941, the Royal Navy captures rotors, code books, settings, charts, you name it. One thing I do have to point out, don't confuse what happened with the cinematic masterpiece of U-571. With Matthew McConaughey, the Americans did not crack Enigma alone. British did a lot of the work. I should also say here the Germans cracked our codes as well. They were reading a lot of our merchant shipping traffic, and they really made good use of radio intelligence in Rommel in North Africa. So that's another really cool story too. But Ultra, as this Enigma code breaking becomes known as, it's just one piece of the puzzle though to defeat the U-boats. One big thing we come up with too are Liberty ships. Liberty ships are 441 feet long, could go at 11 knots if everything's working like it's supposed to. It could carry about 10,000 tons of cargo. Now these ships, you can build them quickly. It used to be you'd have to rivet these ships together. We start using prefabricated welding essentially. So there's a lot of people entering the shipbuilding industry that don't necessarily know how to build ships, but this simplifies it. We built 2,710 of these during the war. We had it down by the end. We're cranking one of these out about 1 every 42 days. So those are flying out. You had destroyer escorts. Destroyer escorts are less expensive and faster to build than normal destroyers, and were built specifically for anti-submarine warfare, which made them ideal U-boat hunters. We ramp up construction on DEs in April 43. We end up building about 500 of them just in the United States. Support groups. So convoys on average had to go about 3,000 miles, and it took about 20 days to get to the United Kingdom, about 18 to get back to the US. And convoys needed protections the whole way. And support groups were small, well-trained offensive groups of warships that would go out and seek out U-boats. So instead of sticking with the convoy and waiting for the U-boats to attack, they'd actually go look for them. So what? You had all this stuff. Why were the Germans still sinking ships, right? So I thought a map might be useful here, so you have to suffer through my terrible Microsoft Paint. But aircraft probably had the biggest impact on winning the U-boat war. But through 1943, you still had to rely primarily on land-based aircraft to provide air cover to the convoys. They could only go so far, and they never had enough of them. So if you look here in the middle, hopefully y'all can see my cursor. You see this kind of circle here. That's the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. So you could fly planes from the United States, you could fly planes from Britain, but they couldn't quite reach a spot right here in the middle. And the Germans knew where that spot was, and that's where a lot of the U-boats would mass. And if you look at maps of where all these merchant ship sinkings occurred, a lot of them are right there in that Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. The largest convoy battle of the war took place in March 1943 with convoys SC-122 and HX-229. 22 merchant ships are lost, and they only sank one U-boat. In March 43, the Germans sank 599,000 tons of shipping. Losses were bad enough in March 43 that the idea was kind of floated around by some folks of, can convoys still work? Do we need to come up with something else? Another good quote from this time period was, the Germans never came so near to disrupting communication between the old world and the new as the first 20 days of March 1943. So even with all this stuff coming online, the Germans are still sinking an outrageous number of ships. But if you really dig into the numbers, it's not as bad as it looks on the surface. No pun intended. 90% of the ships in convoy on average were still getting to their ports. Allied effectiveness against U-boats was increasing, with the average tonnage loss against a U-boat went from 45,000 tons of merchant shipping per one U-boat in 1942 to 28,000 tons in 1943. It's also important to note at this time that U.S. shipyards are cranking out 1.3 million tons of merchant shipping every month by March 1943. So even though the Germans sank 600,000 tons in March, we're still outproducing the loss rate. April was better for the Allies, with U-boats losses to U-boats dropping to 48 ships and 276,000 tons. But the big thing happening now for the Germans was the loss of experienced U-boat commanders. The loss of these experienced, aggressive commanders meant less attacks and sinkings. One of the craziest stats I've ever seen is that 30 U-boat commanders accounted for 30% of the sinkings, merchant ship sinkings during the war, and all of them entered service before 1935. Even more incredible than that, 14 of them accounted for 20% of the sinkings. So the new U-boat commanders just aren't up to the same quality as the old ones were, and they're getting killed before they become good at it, is what it boils down to. By the end of the war, another incredible stat, only 50% of U-boats actually get a shot off at an Allied ship during the war. The rest of them don't. So German effectiveness is going down and Allied effectiveness is going up. So May 1943 is kind of setting up as this do or die month for both sides. And the big turning point in May is convoy ONS 5. In May 43, the Germans had 134 U-boats in the Atlantic, and that's the highest number they've had to that point during the war. Commander Peter Gretton was 30 years old and commanded Escort Group B7 for ONS 5, and he's one of the best escort commanders of the war, also Royal Navy should be noted. ONS 5 would need him in the ships, though. I should say ONS 5, so all these convoys, the letters mean something. So ONS means outward North Atlantic slow convoy 5. So you had fast and slow convoys, depending on how fast or slow how slow the slowest ship was. That's what it kind of boils down to. And ONS 5 had 42 merchant ships and 7 escorts to bring it from the UK to the United States and Canada. The goal was for the convoy to do 7.5 knots crossing, but they rarely ever hit that because of sinkings. The weather got really bad. At one point, the convoy only went 20 miles in a single day. So the Germans would throw 43 total U-boats, at the convoy and would sink 13 merchant ships, but the Allies also sank 7 U-boats and damaged 7 more. And the Germans could not sustain losses on a 1-to-1 ratio. This is kind of the convoy. ONS 5 is the turning point in a convoy battle where the Allies finally surpass and just blow by the Germans during the Battle of the Atlantic. These are 2 of the escort ships in ONS 5, HMS Tay and Duncan. It should be noted here, too, that the Canadians do a lot of the escorting back and forth across the Atlantic. And by the end of the war, they have the third largest Navy in the world. So the Canadians and the British do a lot of the heavy lifting here in the North Atlantic. Another big development in this during this time period are escort carriers. So this is the USS Bode. This is a huge development for convoy protection and a terrible one for the Germans. Escort carriers could basically provide on-demand air cover with the convoy all the way across. The Bode was one of the most prolific U-boat hunters, or submarine hunters of the war, I should say. It sank 10 German U-boats and also 2 Japanese submarines before the end of the war. And she's also the first escort carrier to sink a sub while operating with the convoy. Here's a picture of Bode aircraft attacking U-118 in June 43. The aircraft that are operating from these escort carriers are F-4, F-4 Wildcats. And this picture, you can see all the depth charges lined up on the hangar deck there. And they also had TBF Avengers that were operating off these flat tops. If you look in the front of the bomb bay here, that's a Fido homing torpedo. So we actually had a homing torpedo which would kind of hone in on the cavitations of a German U-boat and sink it. And then in the back, there's 2 depth charges. By the end of the war, the U.S. builds 128 of these CBEs. Sorry, another James map. Another important development during this time, spring 43, was the increasing danger to German U-boats coming and going from their bases in France. The Germans knew where the air gap was in the Atlantic. We knew where U-boats had to come in and out, essentially. And it was a choke point for the U-boats. During August 42 to April 43, we had been sinking U-boats at about a rate of about 10 a month or so. February was the best month. We sank 19. But the air attacks were increasing so rapidly that in May, Dönitz orders his U-boats to essentially fight it out on the surface and to not submerge when an aircraft would attack. And it turns out to be one of the worst decisions of the war. Beginning in May and going through the summer, 26 U-boats are sunk and 17 more are damaged. Some of the planes that were doing this, we saw the fires before, but the Liberators were some of the best U-boat killers. Liberators were basically stripped down and turned into flying gas stations. They could go 2,300 miles and carry 8 250-pound depth charges. They also would fit what they would call Lee lights on these, big searchlights on these airplanes, and they could, at night, they had the radar contact comes back, flip the light on, look for the U-boat, and sink it. You also had flying boats, PBY Catalinas, and then the British Sunderland flying boats. They might be slow and kind of cumbersome, but they're really good U-boat killers as well because they can linger. U.S. 10th Fleet. So Admiral King in May 43 orders everything that is to do with U-boats or anti-submarine warfare to be combined in one command. And 10th Fleet doesn't have ships, but it becomes kind of the nerve center for U-boat, for anti-submarine warfare for the U.S. in the Atlantic. And it has a major impact on the Battle of the Atlantic for the rest of the war. It's kind of a little bit of redemption for King. So why does this matter? Why are we talking about Black Main merchant ships and all? So after ONS 5, 600 merchant ships crossed the Atlantic in May, and only 6 were lost the last 3 weeks. At the end of May, 10,000 tons of shipping were being lost per one U-boat. Going into May, it had been 100,000 tons per one U-boat. In October 43, it was down to 1 merchant ship per 7 U-boats sunk. So the losses for the Germans are just accelerating tremendously. Dönitz orders a withdrawal essentially from the North Atlantic on May 24 to look for more a favorable territory for U-boat attacks. But at this point, the Battle of the Atlantic is essentially lost by the Germans and won by the Allies. In just May, they had lost 41 U-boats in the Atlantic. And to make matters even worse, in the 3 months after May, they lose 79 more. Dönitz even lost his son Peter on May 19th on U-954 when we sank that sub. The last successful convoy attack by U-boats is in September 1943, and the Germans sank 9 ships. But they also lost 3 U-boats sunk, and we damaged 3 more. The Germans had to keep fighting in the Atlantic to tie down Allied men, ships, planes, so we can't use them anywhere else, but it was essentially over in 1943. By the end of the war, the Germans had lost 772 U-boats and had a 70% casualty rate, which is, I think it's the highest out of any branch in World War II, so the losses are just unreal. May 43 was the culmination of all these steps forward that we've talked about, and it definitely was the turning point. And if you recognize this photo on the screen here, it's D-Day. So in order for the Allies to land in Normandy, you need to have secure sea lanes to bring men and material to England for the invasion. By the time the landings happened in June 44, we moved over 16 million tons of supplies just for Normandy. You know, it's not as flashy a topic as D-Day or Iwo Jima or whatever you want to say, but the men on these merchant ships and their escorts delivered desperately needed supplies and enabled the Allies to eventually win the war. So, any questions? I guess let me stop sharing screen here. We have a few. What size was the deck gun, and wasn't it pretty light compared to U.S. destroyers and destroyer escorts? Issue of depth charges aside, so it's not quite the size. I want to say it was 11.7 centimeters. I can't remember exactly what it is off the top of my head, but it was, the U-boats would prefer to use their deck gun to sink ships than torpedoes, which is what made us not having a convoy system off the eastern seaboard so bad, because had these ships been in convoys, they would have had escorts, which would have forced the subs to use torpedoes. So part of the problem was because there were no escorts, they would just surface next to a merchant ship, put a couple of shells in the waterline, and then wait for it to sink. So until we had the convoy system set up, it primarily would love to use the deck gun. We actually have a shell casing in the museum in our Merchant Marine gallery from one of these U-boats in the Gulf. Did the U-boats operating off the U.S. coast have to go all the way back to France to be resupplied? And how long could they typically stay on patrol? So what the Germans developed is like the milk cow is the rough translation, submarine. So these subs wouldn't carry torpedoes. They would carry food and oil to these long. So let me back up. The Germans didn't have a whole lot of long-range U-boats available when we come into the war officially in December and January 41, 42. So they had about 11 or 12 of these milk cow subs that would meet these long-range subs in the middle of the Atlantic and resupply them and allow them to stay on patrol. So this is where, you know, the code breaking and ultra becomes so important, is when, as we start decoding these messages at a faster and more timely rate, we know where these milk cow submarines are going to be, and we can sink and destroy them before they can resupply German U-boats. The Germans refused to believe that we were cracking Enigma. I think they were, you know, we had more of a top secret weapon, you know, than us actually busting into Enigma. But in a couple month period, we basically sank everyone in the milk cow submarines, and that really puts a crimp on them patrolling inside the Gulf of Mexico and along the eastern seaboard. And of course, you know, as we talked about, the us instituting a convoy system off our shore, off the U.S. coastline. So resources to learn more about this stuff. Michael Gannon is kind of, he would be one I would look at. A lot of his books. He has a good one on Drumbeat and Black May, and there's a lot. There's not as much as you would think, but Michael Gannon stuff, I would check there first. How many U-boats are sunk on the surface versus submerged? I want to say the number of the 700 we sank, I want to say about 300 of them are sunk by aircraft. So it's about half and half is what it breaks down to. Did bad weather hamper U-boats' ability to attack? They actually, before we had radar on all our ships and things like that, they loved bad weather because they could sneak up on convoys. That was one thing with ONS 5. It got really foggy at one point during the convoy battle, and the Germans couldn't see, but because the Allies had puffed up and all this radar and sonar, they could, even though they basically had a bag over their heads, we could still see them. And that's when the convoy battle kind of turns at that point. Did Liberty ships have any anti-submarine defense capabilities? They had a few deck guns, but outside of that, they didn't really have sonar or anything like that. They were basically built, if we got one voyage out of a submarine or a Liberty ship, we thought we were doing pretty good. They were built to be disposable, essentially. And, you know, it's a cold way to look at it, but they were just hoping to get one voyage, and that would be it. Now, some of these Liberty ships, you know, a lot of them survived the war, go on and carry cargo in Vietnam, and we even tried to reactivate a few of them for the first Gulf War. And so these are ships that are 60 years old at that point, 40 years old at that point, and we're still trying to use them in 1990. Did the U.S. use their own subs to hunt for U-boats? Not to my knowledge. I know the British, their subs did sink a couple of U-boats. I can't think of any American subs sinking a German U-boat. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody did, but we used our submarines primarily in the Pacific against the Japanese and patrols around the Panama Canal Zone. Let's see. The Germans would have had the Type 11. Yeah, I mean, so if the Germans had the Type 11 at the beginning of the war, that would have been incredibly decisive. But, you know, with everything, Dönitz wasn't always the lead admiral for the German Navy. So the U-boat arm, while he's always asking for more and more and more, didn't really get the full attention of the Germans until he becomes head of the German Navy. And even then, it's our strategic bombing campaign in Europe really hurt U-boat production. So there's a U-boat that comes out at the very end of the war that the Americans, the British, the Soviets all based their immediate post-war submarines on, that it was the first true submarine. One of these, a couple of them did manage to get into the Atlantic, German, and on the day the Germans surrendered, one of these guys in command of one of these subs decides he wants to see how good this thing would have worked. And he comes across a couple of Allied destroyers, and he essentially sails under them without them ever knowing he was there. So had they gotten that U-boat in earlier, yeah, it definitely would have made a big difference. How many ships were lost on the Allied side? Thousands. One thing that's tough with the Battle of the Atlantic numbers, one person says this number, another person says this number. So you kind of, even all the ones I gave you today, you kind of all have, depends on the source you pull them from. And nobody's really wrong. It's just it's hard to have a complete rundown on all these, but it's in the thousands. When an aircraft carrier been available to position in the mid-Atlantic, yeah, so CVEs, those Jeep carriers, that was the answer for that. When the Bogue and the rest of them can go with the convoys to and from, that's what finally closes that air gap. U-boats had anti-aircraft guns, so why didn't the planes get shot down? So yeah, they had anti-aircraft guns, these U-boats, but they didn't have many. You got to imagine, so if you're a U-boat on the surface at night, you don't hear these aircraft until they're basically on top of you. And even then, so the Germans tried to upgun their U-boats with extra flak guns, and even that didn't make that big of a difference. It was just too little, too late. Germans were perpetually behind the Allies when it came to this. Was the air war effective against U-boat pens in Germany and France? So I'm sure a lot of you have seen these big concrete submarine pens that the Germans built in France. That'll probably be there for the rest of the time. We screw up and we don't bomb them while they're under construction. So the thing was, so the Germans only had, those pens can only fit, I want to say about 100 or so, 150 U-boats. So they have all these other U-boats that are stuck out in the open. But we kind of drop the ball when we don't hit those pens when they're under construction. Did Operation Drumbeat lay any mines off the U.S. coast? Yeah, the Germans certainly laid mines. And crazy thing, fact that the first U.S. merchant ship lost was in the Pacific to a German mine laid off Australia. So that's how far they're kind of ranging. How many of the advanced electric subs? Not any. They didn't produce a lot of the electric subs, the Germans, because we kept bombing the facilities and the rail lines that were transporting all the stuff to build them. So that was I would think that's a big win for the strategic bombing campaign. U-boats near the mouth of the Mississippi River. Yeah, big one everybody talks about in the Mississippi River was the SS Robert E. Lee. That gets sunk right there in 1942, I want to say it was. But, you know, they're kind of ranging up and down. The big target for the U-boats were oilers, tanker ships. That's what they want to sink because in World War II, everybody runs on oil. That's kind of the critical resource. And Texas had a lot of it. Louisiana had a lot of it. And that's kind of what they target. And they knew ships had to come out of the mouth of the Mississippi River. It's another choke point like you have in the Bay of Biscay with U-boats coming in and out, or that another spot was Cape Hatteras, they called it Torpedo Junction, where ships had to swing out into the Atlantic because of the way the shoreline was. Any other U-boats on display than U-505 in Chicago? I think they might have a couple in Europe, but I'm not entirely sure. How did the early German U-boat Atlantic campaign compare to U.S. submarine against Japanese shipping? Or are we comparing apples to oranges? Yeah, I mean, so what we do is we do in the Pacific what the Germans are trying to do in the Atlantic. By the end of the war in the Pacific, we've essentially sank the entire Japanese merchant marine. They have there's nothing left. Japanese don't really believe in convoying ships or having escort ships for these. And when we finally got our torpedoes worked out in the Pacific for our subs, we go to town and basically destroy the whole Japanese merchant marine. One reason Dönitz isn't executed as a war criminal at the end of the war is Nimitz essentially says, look, we do the same thing in the Pacific, and that kind of saves Dönitz's life. He still goes to jail or to prison, but he's not executed. How much of a presence in the Atlantic than the American subs have? In the Panama Canal Zone, especially early in the war, the old S-boats we had were around the Panama Canal Zone, but as the war goes on, they pull them out, and a lot of our submarine focus is in the Pacific against the Japanese. U-boat activity off immediate East Coast New York. Yeah, so Drumbeat, one U-boat gets right there to kind of the Ambrose marker into the New York harbor. So they're kind of chilling there, waiting for ships to come out. I mean, they surface and see the lights in New York City, and everybody kind of takes a peek. So that's how unprepared we were. It wasn't uncommon in 1942 for people to be in Miami Beach and see a tanker burning offshore kind of thing. I mean, that's how close it was. All right, I think I answered most of them. Well, I hope y'all have enjoyed it. If not, sorry. But you know, if you have any questions, you know how to get all of this, and I'd be happy to answer any more that I didn't get to today. But other than that, y'all have a good rest of your day.